Thomas Bennett was tired after his long shift at the hospital. The night was cold, and he just wanted to get home to his warm bed. As he walked down the quiet road, he heard a loud crash that broke the silence. He looked up quickly. The sound came from around the corner. Thomas didn't think twice. He ran toward the noise, his heart beating fast. When he turned the corner, he saw it. A small blue car had crashed into a tree. The front of the car was crushed, and smoke was starting to rise from under the hood. "Hello? Is anyone there?" Thomas called out as he ran to the car. Through the cracked window, he could see a woman inside. She was slumped over the steering wheel and wasn't moving. Thomas tried the door handle, but it was stuck. He pulled harder, using all his strength until the door finally opened with a loud creak. "Can you hear me?" he asked the woman. Her eyes were closed, and there was blood running from a cut on her forehead. The woman moved slightly and made a small sound. "Help," she whispered so quietly Thomas could barely hear her. Thomas had worked at the hospital for 10 years. He knew what to do. He carefully checked her neck and back to make sure it was safe to move her. The smell of petrol was getting stronger, and he noticed small flames starting under the car. "My name is Thomas. I'm going to help you," he said in a calm voice. "What's your name?" "Emma," the woman said weakly. "Emma, I need to get you out of this car right now. It's not safe." Thomas reached over and unbuckled her seatbelt. He put one arm under her knees and the other behind her back. Slowly and carefully, he lifted her out of the car. She wasn't heavy, but Thomas was careful not to hurt her more. He carried her a safe distance away from the car and gently laid her on the grass. Just as he did, the flames under the car grew bigger. Thomas took off his jacket and placed it under Emma's head. He pulled out his phone and called for an ambulance. "Help is coming," he told her. "Try to stay awake if you can." Emma's eyes fluttered open. In the moonlight, Thomas could see they were blue. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Thomas stayed with her, holding her hand and talking to keep her awake until they heard sirens in the distance. The ambulance arrived, and the paramedics quickly took over. "You did a good job," one of them told Thomas. "The car could have caught fire completely. You saved her life." Thomas watched as they loaded Emma into the ambulance. He felt he should go with her to make sure she was okay. He climbed into the ambulance and sat quietly as the paramedics worked. At the hospital, Thomas explained what had happened to the doctor on duty. "I was just walking home when I found her," he said. "Her name is Emma. That's all I know." The doctor thanked him and went to take care of Emma. Thomas sat in the waiting room, even though his shift had ended hours ago. He couldn't leave without knowing she would be okay. After about an hour, a nurse came out. "Are you the man who brought Emma Watson in?" she asked. When Thomas nodded, she smiled. "She's going to be fine. She has a concussion and some cuts and bruises, but nothing serious. We've called her husband. He's on his way." Thomas felt relief wash over him. He had done the right thing by staying. He decided to wait just a little longer to make sure Emma had someone with her. He didn't know that in doing so, his life was about to change forever. The simple act of helping a stranger would lead to both the worst and best moments of his life. But for now, he was just glad Emma would be okay. As he sat there, Thomas thought about how quickly life could change. One minute you're walking home thinking about sleep, and the next, you're saving someone's life. He was glad he had been there when Emma needed help. That's what mattered most. Thomas was sitting quietly in the hospital waiting room when a tall man burst through the doors. The man's face was red, and he was breathing hard like he had been running. "Where is my wife?" the man shouted at the nurse behind the desk. "Emma Watson. I got a call she was in an accident." The nurse spoke calmly. "Yes, Mr. Watson. Your wife is in room 105. The doctor is with her now." George Watson didn't wait to hear more. He stormed down the hallway, looking at room numbers as he went. Thomas stood up, thinking he should leave now that Emma's husband had arrived. But something made him follow at a distance. He wanted to make sure Emma was truly okay before he left. When George reached room 105, he pushed the door open hard. Thomas could see into the room from the hallway. Emma was lying in bed with bandages on her head. A doctor was standing beside her, writing something on a clipboard. "Emma!" George rushed to her side and took her hand. "What happened? Who did this to you?" Emma's voice was weak but clear. "I crashed the car, George. I think I fell asleep at the wheel. Someone helped me." The doctor looked up. "Your wife is very lucky, Mr. Watson. A good Samaritan pulled her from the car just before it caught fire. He brought her here in the ambulance." George looked around the room. "Where is this person? I want to thank them." Thomas stepped into the doorway. "Hello," he said quietly. "I'm glad to see you're awake, Emma." George turned around. His eyes narrowed when he saw Thomas. Thomas smiled and took a step forward, extending his hand. "I'm Thomas Bennett. I was walking home when I saw the accident." But George didn't take Thomas's hand. Instead, his face changed. His eyes filled with anger. "You," he said in a low voice. "What were you really doing out there in the middle of the night?" Thomas was confused. "I was just walking home from my shift at the hospital. I work here as a..." "I wasn't talking to you," George shouted. He turned to the doctor. "Why is this man in my wife's room? Who let him in here?" The doctor looked surprised. "Mr. Watson, this is the man who saved your wife's life. He pulled her from the burning car and stayed with her until you arrived." George wasn't listening. He stepped closer to Thomas, his hands curled into fists. "I know what you were really doing. Were you following her? Did you run her off the road?" Emma tried to sit up in bed. "George, stop it. He saved me. The car was on fire, and he pulled me out." "Get away from my wife," George growled, moving even closer to Thomas. "I know what men like you are really after." Thomas raised his hands and took a step back. "Mr. Watson, I understand you're upset. Your wife had an accident, and you're worried. But I promise you, I was just trying to help." "Security!" George yelled suddenly. "Someone get security. This man shouldn't be here." A nurse appeared in the doorway, looking alarmed. "What's going on?" "Sir, please lower your voice. This is a hospital." "This man was with my wife," George said, pointing at Thomas. "I want him removed." The doctor tried to explain again. "Mr. Watson, you're not understanding. Mr. Bennett saved your wife's life. He's a respiratory therapist here at the hospital." But George wasn't listening to reason. His face was twisted with anger and something else, hate. Thomas could see it clearly now. This wasn't just about a husband being protective. There was something darker behind George's eyes. Before anyone could stop him, George lunged forward. His fist connected with Thomas's jaw, sending him stumbling backward into the hallway. Thomas didn't fight back. He just raised his hands to protect his face as George came at him again. "Security," the doctor shouted. "We need security here now." 2 security guards ran down the hallway toward them. They grabbed George and pulled him away from Thomas. "Let me go." George struggled against them. "That man was with my wife. He did something to her." Emma was crying now. "George, stop it. He saved my life. Why are you doing this?" As the security guards held George back, Thomas touched his jaw. It was already starting to swell. A nurse came to him with a concerned look. "Are you okay?" she asked. Thomas nodded slowly. "I'm fine." But inside, he felt a deep sadness. He had only tried to help, and this was how he was repaid. The security guards were taking George away now. He was still yelling, his words full of hate. Thomas watched him go, wondering how someone could be so full of anger toward a complete stranger. George sat alone in a small cell at the police station. His hands were still shaking with anger. The cell was cold and smelled bad. There was only a hard bench to sit on and nothing else. A police officer had taken his watch, belt, and shoelaces when they brought him in. Assaulting someone in a hospital is a serious crime, the officer had told him. George had tried to explain that he was protecting his wife, but no one would listen. Now, as the hours passed slowly, George began to think about what had happened. The anger was still there, but something else was creeping into doubt. He remembered Emma's face when he hit Thomas. She hadn't looked grateful or relieved. She had looked horrified. And she had said Thomas saved her life. Could that be true? The security cameras had caught everything. When the police arrived at the hospital, they watched the video before arresting George. "It's all very clear," the officer said. "You attacked him without provocation, and he didn't fight back." George put his head in his hands. What if he had been wrong? What if Thomas really had just been helping Emma? Meanwhile, Thomas sat in his small flat with an ice pack on his face. His roommate Jack was pacing back and forth, clearly angry. "You should press charges," Jack said for the third time. "That man attacked you for no reason. Look at your face." Thomas gently touched his jaw. It was swollen and turning purple. It hurt to talk, but he answered anyway. "I don't know if that would help anything." "Help?" Jack threw up his hands. "It's not about helping. It's about justice. That man hit you because of the color of your skin. That's a hate crime." Thomas sighed. "Violence just leads to more violence. There has to be another way." Jack shook his head. "Some people never learn unless they face consequences." There was a knock at the door. Jack opened it to find a police officer standing there. "Thomas Bennett?" the officer asked. When Thomas nodded, the officer continued. "I need to take your statement about what happened at the hospital tonight." Thomas told the officer everything that had happened, from finding Emma in the crashed car to George's attack. The officer wrote it all down. "Will you be pressing charges?" the officer asked when Thomas finished. Thomas thought for a moment. "What will happen to him if I do?" Given the circumstances, assault in a hospital, possible hate crime elements, he could face serious jail time. Thomas stared out the window, thinking. "Can I have some time to decide?" "Of course," the officer said. "But don't wait too long." After the officer left, Jack couldn't believe it. "Why would you hesitate? That man deserves to be punished." "Maybe," Thomas said quietly. "But what good would it do? Would it change his mind or just make him hate more?" Back in his cell, George heard keys rattling. The cell door opened, and a different officer stood there. "You have a visitor," the officer said. George followed the officer to a small room with a table and 2 chairs. Emma was sitting in one of them. Her face was pale, with dark circles under her eyes. The bandage on her forehead looked stark white against her skin. When she saw George, she didn't smile. "What were you thinking?" she asked, her voice tight with anger. "I was thinking of protecting you," George said, but the words sounded hollow even to his own ears. "From what? From the man who pulled me out of a burning car?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Do you know what the doctor told me? If Thomas hadn't been there, I would have died." George looked down at his hands. "I didn't know." "You didn't want to know," Emma said. "You saw a black man near me, and you immediately thought the worst. Just like you always do." "That's not fair," George started to say, but Emma cut him off. "It's completely fair. I've watched you do this for years. Judge people before you know anything about them. And now look where it's got you." She stood up. "I can't do this anymore, George." "What are you saying?" George felt cold all over. "I'm saying I'm done. When you get out of here, I won't be home. I'm staying with my sister. As Emma walked out, George felt something break inside him. For the first time, he began to wonder if the problem wasn't with everyone else. Maybe the problem was with him. In his flat, Thomas made a decision. He picked up the phone and called the police officer. "I've decided not to press charges," he said. "But I would like to meet with him. When he's ready." 3 weeks had passed since the night at the hospital. Thomas's face had healed, but he still thought about what had happened. He was washing dishes in his kitchen when he heard a knock at the door. "I'll get it," Jack called from the living room. A moment later, he appeared in the kitchen doorway with a strange look on his face. "There's a woman here to see you. She says her name is Emma Watson." Thomas dried his hands on a towel. "Let her in." Emma stood nervously in the living room. She held a basket covered with a cloth. When she saw Thomas, she gasped softly. His face still showed faint yellow-green bruises along his jaw. "Hello, Emma," Thomas said kindly. "How are you feeling?" "Better," she said, touching the small scar on her forehead. "The doctor says I was very lucky." She held out the basket. "I made you some bread and jam. It's not much, but I wanted to thank you. And to apologize." Thomas took the basket. "You don't need to apologize for anything." "Not for me," Emma said. "For George. For what he did to you." Thomas nodded. "Would you like some tea?" They sat at Thomas's small kitchen table. Emma held her cup in both hands, as if trying to warm them. "George and I are getting divorced," she said suddenly. "I've filed the papers already." Thomas looked surprised. "I'm sorry to hear that." Emma shook her head. "Don't be. It's been a long time coming. What happened at the hospital was just the final straw." She looked down at her tea. "We've been married for 8 years. In all that time, I kept hoping he would change. That he would let go of the hateful ideas his father taught him. But he never did." Thomas listened quietly. He could see the pain in Emma's eyes. "He grew up in a home where people like you were always the enemy," Emma continued. "His father taught him to fear and hate anyone who was different." She looked up at Thomas. "That's not an excuse. It's just. I wanted you to understand." "I do understand," Thomas said. "Hate is taught. It's passed down like a family sickness." Emma nodded. "Exactly. And I tried to help him get better, but he didn't want to change." They talked for a long time. Emma told Thomas about her life, about meeting George at university, about their early happy years before his prejudice began to show. Thomas told her about growing up in London, about becoming a respiratory therapist, about his dreams of someday starting his own clinic. "I heard you didn't press charges," Emma said as she was getting ready to leave. "Why not?" Thomas thought for a moment. Would it have helped? Would putting George in jail make him less angry, less afraid? Probably not, Emma admitted. "I don't hate George," Thomas said quietly. "I feel sorry for him. Living with that much anger must be exhausting." Emma wiped away a tear. "You have every right to hate him." "Maybe," Thomas replied. "But hate is too heavy to carry around. I choose differently." As Emma left, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not for her marriage, which was over, but for herself. For the future. She had seen what real strength looked like today, and it wasn't anything like what she had been taught. The next day, Thomas received a call from the police station. George had been sentenced to community service and mandatory counseling for anger management. The officer also mentioned that George had asked if Thomas would be willing to meet with him someday. "He wants to apologize," the officer explained. "But only when you're ready. No pressure." Thomas was surprised. He had not expected this from George. Maybe there was hope after all. That evening, Thomas sat in his favorite chair by the window, reading a book. Jack came in and sat across from him. I still don't understand you, Jack said. After what that man did, you're considering meeting with him? Thomas put down his book. Everyone deserves a chance to change, Jack. How can people learn to be better if we don't give them that chance? And what if he hasn't changed? What if it's a trick? Thomas smiled slightly. Then at least I tried. At least I showed him there's another way to be. Outside, rain began to fall softly on the windows. Thomas watched the droplets slide down the glass, each one following its own path but all heading in the same direction. Down, toward the earth. Toward something new. 1 year had passed since the night of the accident. Autumn leaves fell around Thomas as he walked toward the community center. Today was the day he had agreed to meet with George Watson. Thomas had thought about this meeting many times. He wasn't sure what to expect. Would George still be angry? Would he truly be sorry? Thomas took a deep breath and pushed open the door. The community center was warm inside. A woman at the front desk smiled at him. Are you Thomas Bennett? George is waiting in room 3. Thomas nodded and walked down the hallway. His heart was beating fast. He stopped outside room 3 and took another deep breath before opening the door. George was sitting at a small table in the center of the room. He looked different than Thomas remembered. Thinner. His face was lined with worry. When he saw Thomas, he stood up quickly. Thank you for coming, George said, his voice shaking a little. I wasn't sure you would. I almost didn't, Thomas admitted. He sat down across from George, leaving plenty of space between them. For a moment, neither man spoke. The silence grew until George finally broke it. I've been in counseling, he said. Every week for the past year. He looked down at his hands. It was part of my sentence, but after a while, I started going because I wanted to. Thomas nodded but didn't say anything. I'd been learning about myself, George continued. About the things my father taught me. About the fear I've carried all my life. He looked up at Thomas. I'm not trying to make excuses. What I did was wrong. I hurt you because of the color of your skin, and nothing can make that okay. No, Thomas agreed. It can't. The counselor helped me understand that my fear wasn't really about you or anyone who looks like you. It was about me. About feeling like I wasn't good enough. George's voice grew quieter. My father was always afraid. Of losing his job, of other people taking what was his. He taught me that fear. Thomas leaned forward slightly. Fear is a powerful thing. It is, George nodded. But it's not an excuse. I've spent my whole life blaming others for my problems. For my feelings. He took a deep breath. I want to apologize to you, Thomas. Not just for hitting you, but for how I thought about you. For what I said. For not seeing you as a person. Thomas studied George's face. He could see the man was truly sorry. Apology accepted, he said simply. George looked surprised. Just like that? Accepting an apology doesn't mean what you did was okay, Thomas explained. It means I'm not going to let it control my life. It means I believe you can be better. They talked for almost an hour. George told Thomas about losing his job after the attack, about Emma filing for divorce, about hitting rock bottom. I deserved it all, he said. But it opened my eyes. What will you do now? Thomas asked. I'm working at a warehouse. It's not much, but it's honest work. George hesitated. And I've been speaking at schools. Telling my story. Hoping it might help some young person avoid my mistakes. When they finished talking, they walked outside together. Thomas wasn't sure if he should shake George's hand or not. But as they reached the parking lot, he decided to offer his hand. George looked at it for a moment, then took it. His grip was firm but gentle. Thank you, George said again. For giving me a chance I didn't deserve. As they let go, they both noticed Emma standing by a car across the lot. She had driven Thomas to the meeting and waited outside. When she saw them together, she smiled slightly. Emma walked over to them. "How did it go?" she asked, looking from one man to the other. "Good," Thomas said. "I think it went well." "Better than I had any right to expect," George added. Emma nodded. "I'm glad." A cool breeze blew through the parking lot, sending leaves swirling around their feet. A photographer from the local paper was taking pictures for a story about the community center's programs. He saw the three of them standing together and raised his camera. "Mind if I take your picture?" he called out. They looked at each other, and then Thomas nodded. The three stood side by side, not touching but together. The photographer snapped the photo. Later, that picture would appear in the newspaper. Three people who had been connected by one moment of crisis. Three people who had each chosen, in their own way, to be better than their fears. As they walked to their cars, Thomas thought about how much had changed in 1 year. How a single night had altered so many lives. How sometimes the hardest thing to do was also the right thing. George got into his car first and drove away with a small wave. Thomas and Emma watched him go. "Do you think he's really changed?" Emma asked. Thomas looked after George's car. "I think he's trying," he said. "And sometimes, trying is the bravest thing we can do."